We are in an intellectual minefield, and it starts with our children from the day they go to school. In fact, it can even start before they go to school if they're not careful which books they buy for them as they're learning to read. They might buy one on evolution, for example, that begins millions of years ago. They're being caught into a mindset before they even learn to read properly. We must be careful what our children then are given to read, and also ready with answers to be able to help them with these problems. We are accused of brainwashing our children with religion, with Jesus and what he's come into the world for, and what he's about, and what's required of us, with worship, with the Bible. We're accused of brainwashing. They suggest that it's really a lot of stories, especially when you go into Genesis, and not to be taken seriously, but it's kind of a fairy story with a moral meaning, and even at times, not even that. That's the way they see what we do when we bring up our children to know the Lord. To them, it's like telling them stories about Prince Charming and the princess and things like that. And we say, it's like that. These stories are not really true, but you enjoy them whilst you listen to them. As we grew up ourselves, because this to some degree happened to us, I remember being told fairy stories as a child, we began to realize that these fairy stories were not true, and they usually began with, long, long ago, there was a prince or a princess. And so the fairy tale began, long, long ago. They tell to us fairy stories about dinosaurs. Now, I'm not saying dinosaurs didn't exist, but the way they put it forward to us, dinosaur incidentally means a terrible lizard, and bones of dinosaur were discovered in the 1900s, and they had difficulty trying to fathom what they were all about. But we've learnt a lot about them, their shape and so on. And so the children are given little books about these terrible lizards, and they're very colourful, and they feel, wow, look at that. And there's no harm in him trying to understand about dinosaurs and what they look like. They were immense creatures, but not all of them. Some were very small. Millions of years ago, and immediately they've got the child, because they implanted in the mind this idea of millions of years. Now they, who accuse us of brainwashing our children with Jesus and religion and so on, have begun to brainwash from childhood our children, and it continues in school. But whereas we are discredited and ridiculed for what we teach about creation and Jesus and his reasons and his death and his resurrection and so on, the media does not discredit them for what they teach and say about dinosaurs that can't possibly be true. They say, for example, 235 or so million years ago, these dinosaurs roamed this earth, and there were no human beings around. No human being ever saw these dinosaurs. So there are no witnesses, and yet they're very dogmatic about the age and what they were like. There's no label on the bones, and that's about all we find of dinosaurs is bones. And sometimes the wrong ones get mixed up together and then they get embarrassed and go very quiet about the mess they've made of it. But that's all we find is bones. There's no label on the bones that says these bones are so old, 235 million years. But there have been mammoths found in Siberia. At one time, they were thought of being dinosaurs. But now they're having to admit that people did exist at the time of mammoths, and that mammoths are so very much like elephants, they could be of the same kind. They're even found with flesh on and even found with food in their stomachs, so we can get to know a lot about them. But the problem is they are too recent. They're not from millions of years ago, and so they have second thoughts on mammoths. No doubt when you were young, you heard about St. George, as he's called, and the dragon, and how he fought and slew the dragon and became a hero. A dragon, a large creature which to some extent looked like a dinosaur perhaps, breathing fire. How could you think of anything so ridiculous is put to us? The things about dragons is far-fetched. It's really, to a large extent, Chinese fairy tales. And you see them nowadays dancing around with mock dragon covering every year on a particular day, these supposed replicas of dragons. And it's great fun, but not to be taken seriously. Or is it? Is there some truth behind it all? How many of you, if you want to raise your hands, have heard of the bombardier beetle? Very tiny insect. We got one response. A bombardier beetle, and I think you're not told about it because what it does. Its enemies come up behind it, and how does it drive off its enemy that's there to swallow it up? It has two glands in its backside, and one gland issues a kind of oxygen and another a very highly inflammable gas. And these come together outside the bombardier beetle and burst into flame and drive off its opponent, the bombardier beetle. Well, if that can happen with a tiny, tiny beetle, why are dragons supposed to be fairy tale? Perhaps there's more truth to it than we know, but we just don't have the evidence to say either way. So let's not just brush it off and say it's a far-fetched fairy tale. Nobody is saying that the bombardier beetle is a far-fetched fairy tale. It's just that you hardly ever hear about it. And only one person on the screen did I see raised his hand to say he's heard about it. Now, how do we know about dinosaurs? Well, we've got bones, virtually nothing else. Sometimes there's impressions of what seem to be fur or hair. But other than that, with no flesh, we can't date it properly. A lot of it is guesswork as to what it looked like. The artist imagines, by comparing with other animals of the present day, how much flesh was on the bones and its appearance. And most of it is pure supposition. It might be right, but there's no evidence. But we have, they say, the tree of life. And you've probably seen the tree of life, which is pictured like a tree with branches going off in all directions, starting with one representing one animal in the trunk, the original animal that ever was, and it developing into several types of animals, and they're branching out into several types of animals, and this tree of life is still going on, and we're at the top of this tree of life. It looks good, it sounds convincing, but it must have taken a long, long time for that tree of life to have come from what was there originally to all that we have throughout the world of life today, it must have taken a long, long time. So you see why they insist on long ages. How could all that happen then? It must be given enough time so that we have, the story goes, rock, and the sea beats up against the rock and forms a scum. And the scum, one little bit of it, assembles as though it's been designed in a shape and suddenly comes to a life. The amoeba, smallest single-celled animal that is supposed to be the beginning of all life. So where did the life come from? How did all those elements from the scum suddenly, in some way, assemble itself so that the first one began, and then eventually becoming human beings? But it must have taken a long, long time. And that's why you have your millions of years. Now, who arranged the mud so that the chemicals were in correct order? Pure accident, not design. If anything like that happened today, somebody designed something today, would we write it off as pure accident? From the amoeba to me, they tell us, one cell is the amoeba, but the next cell, you'd expect, if it was developing from one cell, to become 2 cells, to become 4 cells, to become 16 cells, but it doesn't happen like that. The next known simplest form of life is a trichoplast, and it has 6 different types of single cells. It's not multiplied into several cells. That's a long way off from one cell. But they insist that rock becomes mud, becomes humans, given enough time. They'll mock you about, look at all the different kind of dogs in the world. You're not telling me all those dogs came from one wolfhound. They're telling us that rock became all the life that exists today in its variety forms by gradual evolution. And they can't accept that breeding caused all these types of dogs to come from one wolfhound. You know, a dog has no difficulty recognizing a cat, and a cat has no difficulty recognizing a dog. So we talk about species, but no longer do we talk much about species, because although we understood species when I was young to be those that could not cross over into the other types, now they've tried to blur the borders, that there are no borders, and it's all a gradual change from one type of thing to another. But the Bible doesn't call them species, thankfully. The Bible calls them kinds. Kinds must not be confused with species. So the alternative given to us by God, we understand, is in Genesis chapter 1, where he created several things in chapter 1. He created the land animals, he created the animals in the air, he created the animals in the sea, and they multiplied according to their kind, each one according to its kind. And there are no bridges between the kinds. They're all distinctly different, even though there might be varieties within the kind. This is what we learn from the scriptures. So when did dinosaurs live? Where are the witnesses? Does the Bible tell us when dinosaurs lived and where the witnesses are? Well, as I showed in Genesis 1, it doesn't call them dinosaurs, it calls them kind. And if you look in Job 41, the Leviathan, see what an amazing creature he is. And Job is a witness. And there were probably many other witnesses at the time too. And that's not very long ago when you're comparing it with 235 million years. Because if you take the age of Adam and when he had a son, and when he had a son, and when he had a son, and go right down to about the time of the captivity, where we can lock it into history, and work it backwards the number of years. Creation took place, Genesis chapter 1 and 2, took place about 4,000 years ago, not millions of years ago. Oh, come on, Alan, 4,000? Yes, 4,000 years ago. And there's no sound reason for believing otherwise. In chapter 40 of Job, verses 15. Now look at the behemoth, which I made along with you. This is God talking to Job, a human being. And he's saying that the behemoth was made at the same time as a human being. And if you go into Genesis chapters 1 and 2, you find that within the same week, all living creatures and the whole of the universe was created. So he said, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. Now, those of you that have studied dinosaurs and what they're supposed to eat, although we don't really know, but how they're supposed to have lived and so on, some of this might ring a bell if you enjoyed learning about dinosaurs. See now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. Early translators thought this referred to elephants. But let's carry on. This is not just elephants. But you know, if there'd never been any elephants that we knew and they were back in long distant history, we'd probably believe that they were dinosaurs as well, wouldn't we? However, let's carry on. He moves his tail like a cedar. An elephant moves its tail like a cedar tree. It's a little thing. So it's not an elephant. It's nothing we know. But it has a big, long tail that sways like a cedar tree. Is that making you think? The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are made like beams of bronze. His ribs are like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. In other words, he was created at the beginning. In the beginning, only he who made him can bring near his sword. In other words, he's that powerful that nobody could slay him with a sword. George and the dragon, probably not that particular dinosaur. Surely the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies under the lotus trees in a cover of reeds and marsh. So he wallows in water, marshy water. The lotus trees cover him with their shade. The willows by the brook surround him. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. He's that big. He is confident, though the Jordan gushes into his mouth. That's a big, powerful mouth. Though he takes it in his eyes are not affected by that kind of thing. Or someone pierces his nose with a snare. You can't trap him. He's that powerful. Now, does that bring to your mind any of the dinosaurs? It's obviously not a hippopotamus. Could it be a brachiosaurus with a cedar-like tail that sways from side to side? According to Genesis chapter 1, verses 24 and 25, God made them. He made the dinosaurs with everything else. And God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing and beasts of the earth, each according to its kind. And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind, including dinosaurs. And God saw that it was good. And they are marvelous creatures. He saw that it was good. When was the beginning? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In those 6 days, the whole of creation? Yes, in those 6 days. Matthew chapter 19, start at verse 3. Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife or just any reason? And he answered and said to them, have you not heard? Or Jesus is talking of something that's factual, that he expected them all to know about as being factual. He that made them at the beginning made them male and female. And we saw that in the same week, male was made, same week, and also in chapter 2, that female was made at the beginning. When is the beginning? Genesis chapter 1. Now, Jesus believed that, and he used it in his argument. And if it's a faulty argument, a faulty premise, then the argument holds no water. There's no point in making an argument on a premise that's faulty. But he believed it to the extent that he expected them to understand the principle he was going to give. He said, for this reason, or for this cause, depending on which you're reading, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate, which in modern English means nobody should split it up. Now, he's based that on what? On a fallacy, on a fairy tale, on a long, long ago story, on millions of years ago story. He's based it on the facts of Genesis chapter 1 and 2. For this cause, for this reason. Whom do we believe? Whom do we want our children to believe? Now, what's the danger? Now, evolution wasn't talked a lot about when I was very young, in my 5 years upwards, when I went to school for the first time. It was a school with two teachers, a headmistress, who was a spinster, and her assistant. The headmistress took the older ones, and sometimes she would give a lecture to the whole school. At that time, the war was on, and usually the lecture was to what we should do to help the troops and support the war. But this particular time, she explained, according to the way she was thinking, that we came from, in those days, they used to say monkeys. They've stopped saying monkeys, but something like monkeys. We came from monkeys. And I'd heard Genesis chapter 1. And this puzzled me at 5 years old. And I went home to my father and I said, Dad, Miss Gregg says that we came from monkeys. And he just went quiet. Now, my dad could talk. And I used to listen to him for hours and hours explaining things. And he always had an answer for something. But this time, he never said a word. Now, my dad was a strong believer. He believed in Jesus and he believed in God. He believed in creation. But he hadn't got an answer. And so I grew up with two views. One is Jesus was Son of God and all that implied. And the other, that the creation story was just a story, a fairy tale. Couldn't be true. And even when I first heard the gospel on the market square in Wigan, and Brother Frank Walton was one of the speakers, and they'd just broken up, and he was doing a week of talks in Jackson Square, Schools, Wigan, on the gospel, and I was invited to go to each one, and by that weekend I was baptized. But I had not dealt with the problem, or even thought about the problem of Genesis chapter 1. And the fact that Jesus had made reference to it didn't register me at that time. So I was struggling with that for some time, and especially when I came to realize that Jesus obviously took it for granted that Genesis chapter 1 was a premise that you could build facts on. And it took me ages of struggling, and I couldn't turn to anybody. Such was the anger sometimes when I asked these questions to brothers in the church, that I should even think of the possibility of Genesis not being right, and that I should not accept evolution, that I got too afraid to talk to them. And they didn't have an answer. And I think that was part of the problem. They were right in sticking to their faith, but the problem was they didn't have an answer. Brothers and sisters, when we're talking to young people who are being subjected to this vile doctrine of evolution and all its implication, have we got an answer? Have we looked into it? Are we able to explain to them? Or do we just get hold of the book and says, the Bible says, thumping it? Probably we don't go to that extent, but that's the way it was answered. We have to be able to answer everyone who asks us for a reason for the hope that lies within us, and that hope depends on our faith, our trust in Jesus and his teaching, and everything he said was trustworthy. So the question is, having heard so far so much, and if we're able to present evidence more fluently probably than I can, if you were in your child's situation or in a friend's child's situation, knowing that everything Jesus said and about Jesus and the creation and him being in at the beginning, and that all of this ties up together and Jesus is it, knowing that, would they believe this or the teachers? And that's what we're saying. The teachers were supposed to give a good education and we rely on them. We're asking the child, and don't forget their friends are probably asking them questions. Are we making the effort to find the answers, or to take someone whom you know probably does have the answer and help them through that difficult situation? So will they finish up believing in Jesus or in the wild speculation of so-called scientists? For to me, a scientist is somebody who bases what he understands on facts that have been demonstrated and examined and proved to be true, not theory. Theoretical scientists are not real scientists, they're speculators. So do we listen to the speculators who are speculating about dinosaurs and the creation and how old the universe is and how it started? And was it a big bang? And here we are. Or will they believe in Jesus who loves them and gave himself for them? I can't help bringing up Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. Where Paul pours his heart out. Galatians chapter 2, he says, I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. This is Paul pouring his heart out. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. That's going to be a child's choice.